Welcome to the panel on promoting civil discourse through L2 language instruction. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Upper Valley Educators Institute based in New England, a meeting of which was the impetus for this roundtable. This was an online discussion last fall of the role of civil discourse in building and maintaining community in high school settings. And it made me realize what a critical role the humanities and language teaching in particular can play in promoting not only community, as we often discuss, but also specific skills that contribute to civil discourse as a component of community. The overarching framework is, how can we help students practice and develop linguistic structures, frames, and mindsets of both agreement and disagreement in ways that contribute to interaction rather than isolation, and enable our students to thrive as active participants in the various communities in which they live and will live in their adult lives. So I'll start showing my slides. So building on the work of colleagues at the pre-college level, how can we help students practice and develop linguistic structures? Excuse me, I can't see my slides. Frames and mindsets, as I said, are both agreement and disagreement that enable them to interact and thrive as active participants in multifaceted, diverse communities. And this panel will include 6 discussants. After my overview of the topic, Tony Brown will talk about debates in language classes. Karen Evans-Romaine will talk about her course on media literacy. Tatiana Pshenina will talk about the development of spontaneous speech. Sandugash Sansyzbaeva will talk about the development of writing skills. And then Dan will wrap up talking about transformative education, transformative learning at the end of this panel. So many high schools have developed so-called discussion norms and guidelines, many high schools and school districts to help students to have positive discourse, including disagree with the idea, not the person, avoid absolutes, ground facts in specific sources, paraphrase what you hear, repeat the facts to confirm accuracy, ask open-ended questions, and some basis on an idea of 3 R's of active listening: repeat, reflect, and respond. So I'd like to talk about some linguistic structures that are involved in that relate directly to these discussion norm guidelines. I believe that we can have an intentional approach to promoting civil discourse integrated into the study of language structures, pragmatic frameworks, and our preparation for study abroad. So, for example, language structures include expressions of comparison and contrast that we teach anyways. We help develop students develop advanced levels of discourse on the ADPL scale. For example, similarities. Even at the lowest levels, students can learn "gak-i" as a fixed phrase, learn as an idiom, and this emphasizes the idea of active listening, building on and learning from the previous speaker, and also reinforces a sense of community. I think students sometimes need to be told, especially now more than before, I'm finding, the other students in your class are part of your community and you're part of their learning. You're doing your homework, contributes to the sense of community. And in speaking, the previous speaker's input is part of your learning. Building connections between students, and this is possible even at the lowest levels of language learning. Likewise, expressions of contrast. Students can learn as a fixed phrase as soon as they have the genitive case early on, helping students lean into both similarities and differences. I'm finding that students are fine with leaning into similarities, but they're having an increasing difficulty leaning into differences. practicing and feeling comfortable leaning into both similarities and differences. Also, expressions of contrast to expectations, vulnerability. My students love the expression chestna говоря, low level of admitting while reinforcing that pricastio, which is otherwise sometimes somewhat elusive. And so we can, like I said, help students lean into both similarities and differences from low stakes contexts in our language classes at the lowest levels, even concrete based item practice to increasingly more abstract, potentially controversial, building on frequently practiced structures and the sense of community that we tend to excel at creating in our language classes, and gradually becoming more complex along with that natural process of development of more abstract structures as students go up on the Atwill scale. Another point is agreement and disagreement, going back to the idea of focusing on specific points, fact-based, evidence-based, in parallel to the development of more advanced language structures. So not just я согласна, я согласен, я не согласен. Already getting students to disagree is something they're not always used to, as I mentioned, but specifically я согласна, я не согласна с тем, что, and with fact-based and specific points as the basis, while repeating that complex structures. Similarity and difference also, чем вы похожи, чем вы отличаетесь, focus on specific points as the basis for agreement and disagreement. Substantiating interpretations and opinions. I think in many of our classes, students know that whatever they say, we're going to have почему follow to help them develop complex structures. So мне так кажется, потому что, во-первых, во-вторых, this is all part of what we do to help students, at least in the flagship programs when we know we're sending students overseas, to develop, to prepare them for higher levels of language learning. So you can see that there are direct parallels with the discussion norm guidelines that our pre-college colleagues have developed so thoroughly. And developing these is not something that has to add anything to the time that we spend. It doesn't take away from anything else because it's in direct alignment with the development of higher level skills. Pragmatic frames, this also overlaps with the idea of pragmatic frames to prepare students for interactions. Most of our students, their primary goal is interacting with native speakers, going overseas. So learning how to lean into disagreement and continue to express their own ideas, feeling comfortable. This is a phrase that I really enjoyed that I heard from in the SRLT program. I don't know how native speakers interpret this, but from my perspective, and certainly from my students who are very English dominant, what I hear when I heard this person saying this, one of the instructors in this LT program, what I heard first and foremost was, "Мы с вами, I'm with you, but we're going in different directions." So it's a very, at least from my perspective, unabrasive, and but this does allow the person to disagree without feeling like they're being overly aggressive. Another thing that I've been experimenting with my students, I'm doing a lot of experimentation with ChatGPT these days, both how to use it and not how to use it, and developing AI skepticism. AI is a great opportunity to practice polite disagreement. If students ask me something in class that I don't know how to say, or they want it in a phrasing that I don't think sounds quite Russian, I'll go to ChatGPT. Chances are it's not going to be totally right, and then I'll say "не лучше разве." So students can practice these with ChatGPT, even if they're uncomfortable disagreeing. As I said, they increasingly are. They can disagree with ChatGPT and learn how to practice these phrases, because once they're in country, it's quite a bit more difficult when you're put on the spot. Another thing is admitting if you didn't catch something. Students actually really like this phrase, and it's a great illustration of the perfective. You heard, but you didn't hear successfully. And this is actually a good context, a good phrase for drills, where you need students to repeat things repeatedly. It could be boring otherwise. Students very happily act out, я не расслышала. And this is important in discourse. If you hear something that may be controversial, that you may think you can confirm that you actually heard correctly. It also gives the other speaker a chance to reconfigure. They can see you're not quite comfortable with that, maybe switch topics. It also enables, one of the things I stress with my students is how not to respond immediately if you don't know how to respond or if you're uncomfortable. So rather than responding with an emotional response, give yourself a moment to calm down and just delay your response and think of a way to respond that isn't quite so emotional. So all of these things. Another thing is expressions of empathy, building a classroom, a linguistic culture of empathy. I think it's really important to build the sense of empathy that enables us to disagree in our classroom and have things like debate comfortably. In terms of preparation for study abroad, I want to mention the flagship culture initiative panel that was recorded from yesterday that will be available by the end of the summer. Many things that I believe we need to address directly in our classes for preparation, and that enable us to use these constructions that I first mentioned within motivated context and preparation for study abroad. Responding to unwanted advice in homestay and other contexts, it seems to me that's a characteristic feature of Russian language more than Czech, for example. Constant advice, choice of clothing, medical treatment, lifestyle choices. Disagreeing with the host parent, even though that relationship is very hierarchical, how do you retain your own views in a polite way? I think that this needs to be practiced in advance. Declining unwanted help or food, avoiding topics. These are addressed in the flagship culture initiative, and I think that these are things that are really important for us to address with our students. Given the fact that our students are reluctant to express disagreement in general in their lives, we can give a platform for them to do this in language classes, and we can have them pre-practice how to retain their own identity in ways that they're comfortable with, as is the goal of the flagship cultural initiative. So summing up, I believe that foreign language use, even though, as Václav Havel has pointed out so eloquently, words can be a barrier and very often are a barrier and can be used as a barrier and can be weaponized. Foreign language instruction can contribute to the use of language as a pillar of civil discourse, civil engagement, and community, using these language structures that are a part of what we teach students anyway in the development of more advanced language structures. So now we'll turn to Tony Brown. We're going to turn to specific contexts where civil discourse can be practiced. Debates, media literacy course, developing spontaneous speech, writing skills, and then transformative and an overall framework of transformative education. So let's turn now to Tony Brown, and I'll just say a few words about him and put a link in the chat for you to his book on debate in foreign language instruction. Tony Brown completed advanced degrees in Russian and second language instruction at Bryn Mawr College. Since joining the faculty at Brigham University in 2004, he's taught courses in Russian language and cultural history and published in these areas. In addition, he directs internship programs for the David M. Kennedy Center for International Studies at Brigham Young University throughout Europe and Central Asia. And I'm going to put in a link in the chat to the Mastering Language Through Global Debate series. This conference is both in the moment, in my view, and also launches us into the future. So this is a resource you can use in the future.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you for organizing this wonderful panel. Colleagues, it's a pleasure to be with you today. In 2006, just a little background, I was attending a conference in Moscow and crossed paths with a longtime friend who at the time was working as a public diplomacy officer for the State Department. After catching up on each other's lives, he asked, "Tony, I recently met with students in Moscow, Saratov and Vladivostok, who'd like to debate with American students. Perhaps this could be a way to build bridges of understanding. Do you have students who could debate with them in Russian? I replied that we didn't have such a class per se in Russian, but that I'd give the matter some thought and see what I could do. So after returning to the States, I began a crash course on debate. And in the process, realized that the criteria outlined in the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages Speaking Performance Profile dovetailed beautifully with qualities emphasized in public speaking and debate. Now, although language enhancement represented the primary outcome of the course, increased cross-cultural understanding and mutual respect likewise grew out of the experience. In his seminal work titled Rhetoric, Aristotle established a rhetorical tradition that has and continues to permeate Western civilization. However, his objective in writing rhetoric was not to describe Greek rhetoric, but to describe this universal facet of human communication. Like a game of chess, there are different strategies that can be used in debate. And the Greek philosophers suggested at least 5 points of stasis, as they called them, or the imaginary points in the mind of the audience, where arguments for clash with arguments against. In particular, number one, conjecture, what if questions, right? For example, what would happen if we gave top priority to economic development all the time in all situations? Second one, definition questions. For example, what does environment mean? 3, cause and consequence questions. For example, what are the likely results of an increase in global temperatures? 4, value questions. For example, do human beings have a responsibility to protect the environment, such as the Brazilian rainforest, even at the expense of improving human life? And the 5th, procedural questions, such as how do we develop an approach to sustainability that both protects the environment as well as helps nations develop economically? Now, failure to understand different types of argumentation, such as these different stases, often leads to a situation in which people end up talking past each other rather than meeting at the point of conflict or stasis and addressing the actual issue under consideration from a common rhetorical vantage point. Sadly, what media outlets and local, state, and federal governments bill as debates often amount to nothing more than soapbox speeches that offer little to no consideration for the opposing side. So if we're to believe personal accounts, spanning back to the first half of the 19th century in America, debate played an integral role in the fabric of society. Journals from that era reference debate both as an art form and entertainment that integrated the intellectual and the pragmatic. As one Midwesterner recorded in February 1842, quote, "At this time, debates were held weekly and entered into by men of the first talents in the city, young and old, for the purpose of eliciting truth, acquiring knowledge, and improving in public speaking," close quote. Clearly, debates afforded an excellent exercise in logical thinking and expression. Fast forward now to Europe in the second half of the 20th century. Czesław Miłosz, a Nobel Prize-winning poet who, after the communist takeover, defected from Poland to France. Likewise, he viewed unbiased debate as a means of fostering a discussion of history, unhindered by ideology and dogma. Now, what I want to do is just look at a few nuts and bolts, practical ways of going about structuring a debate in the classroom. And where I want to start is by addressing the question of how to determine positions. Creating teams for the proposition and opposition can be accomplished in a number of ways. Some factors to consider in creating teams include the proficiency range of participants and how to give students of varying abilities a chance to work together on teams, odd or even numbers of students, and whether or not to account for a rotating alternate, gender distribution across teams, and the like. Developing an algorithm of sorts to account for multiple variables can become tedious and time-consuming. Considerably simpler yet surprisingly effective approach entails assigning each position a letter. For example, Team A equals the proposition, Team B the opposition, and having participants simply draw a letter. The letter a participant draws determines the position he or she will adopt and the team he or she will join for a given topic. Regardless of the approach to creating heterogeneous teams whose members hold differing views, exposing learners to diverse perspectives on an issue facilitates cognitive growth and encourages open-mindedness. Learners should be instructed to articulate their positions clearly and to listen carefully and respectfully to the viewpoints of fellow students. A second approach to creating teams involves having students move to one corner of the room based on their stance on a particular issue. For instance, students may move to a corner of the room that represents their level of agreement with a particular statement. Strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree. If the learners are equally distributed, consider forming 4-member teams by taking a pair of students from 2 different sides of the room. For example, students espousing different positions. Within these 4-member teams, have students who share the same viewpoint discuss their best arguments. After a designated period of time, reconstitute the 4-member team and have the pairs share their ideas with one another. At the conclusion of this procedure, have all 4 students work together to create a final product that represents the best arguments for both sides of the issue. And the last approach I want to address is, when it comes to forming teams, is what could be called a value line. Posting signs on opposite sides of the room that read, strongly agree, strongly disagree. And then put a line of masking tape down the middle of the room connecting the 2 signs. Then, orally or in writing, present a controversial statement such as, government has the right to spy on its citizens in order to protect them from terrorist acts. That'll get them thinking. Give students a few minutes to write down their answers along with one argument to support their viewpoint. And next, ask participants to take a stand by positioning themselves along the tape between strongly agree and strongly disagree. This line serves as an opinion spectrum. From this rank-ordered line, form teams of 4 or more people by joining someone from each end of the continuum, as well as 2 learners standing near the middle. Now, each of these exercises seeks to bring needed balance to otherwise hotly contested issues. Debate, if conducted properly, need not degenerate into inflammatory or accusatory speech. Rather, it can provide critical scaffolding for understanding both sides of an issue and encourage openness to discovering truth through thoughtful examination and deliberation of ideas. Now, as I said, incorporating debate in the foreign language classroom can take on many forms, and one is not necessarily better than another. What matters is that the style of debate works best for the goals of the course. For a course focused primarily on developing language skills, looser formats such as Socratic discussion or dialogue may be just as effective. Unlike debates in which individuals try to win the argument by listening to their opponents primarily to find weaknesses and offer counterarguments, a dialogue allows shared understanding. The benefits of Socratic discussions are many. They allow students to work together, listen to and respond to one another, and change points of view as appropriate. Dialogues also allow learners to practice getting and holding the floor, as well as techniques for drawing others into the discussion. So regardless of the format and the second language superimposed on it, open-mindedness plays an essential role in facilitating a meaningful and productive outcome. I find in Professor Irwin Weil, a longtime friend and colleague to many here, a paragon of open-minded truth-seeking. Recounting an experience that he had talking to former officers of the U.S. Army, Professor Weil writes, quote, they had been fed an awful lot of propaganda about our commie enemies and that sort of thing. I said, you know, I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, And I often hear terrible things about the United States from the people there. Bourgeois, reactionary imperialists, racist unemployment, and public vulgarity. And I say to them, well, to a certain extent, what you're learning about the United States is true. But if you want to understand the country, you've got to understand both sides. Just as there's a negative side to America, there's also a positive side, like marvelous universities, good hospitals, wonderful music, free and fair elections, and freedom of speech. These are good things, and one must understand them to get a real picture of the country. At the same time, one must understand the opposite, negative sides. Such phenomena as such phenomena as unemployment, racism, and extensive public vulgarity. As in any large collection of human beings, there are two sides of a coin. True understanding requires a balance of vision. Close quote. What I want to do is close with one other aspect of debate, and that is humor. As I mentioned earlier, debate, as the term often is employed in the US context, need not suggest a combative or contentious spirit of engagement. American debate typically places a premium on driving home one's position, while British debate favors supporting one's opinion and precision of language, which includes wit and humor. Indeed, if used properly, humor can establish rapport and informality, bring people together, introduce risky ideas, and even present criticism in an acceptable way. Former US President Ronald Reagan was a proponent of humor, and throughout his political career, he used it to take the sharp edge off serious messages. And during the 1984 presidential debate with Walter Mondale, that some in this audience will recall, Reagan cleverly undermined the credibility of speculation about his age and simultaneously his political opponent's experience. What I want to do is show this 30-second clip and close with it. See if I can pull it up here.
Truitt, your question to President Reagan. Mr. President, I want to raise an issue that I think has been lurking out there for 2 or 3 weeks and cast it specifically in national security terms. You already are the oldest president in history, and some of your staff say you were tired after your most recent encounter with Mr. Mondale. I recall yet that President Kennedy had to go for days on end with very little sleep during the Cuba Missile Crisis. Is there any doubt in your mind that you would be able to function in such circumstances?
Not at all, Mr. Truitt, and I want you to know that also I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
Okay. I regardless of one's political persuasions, I think his use of humor was quite ingenious. And so, Susan, with that, I think I will conclude my remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's quite interesting. Some of the phrases that stood out in your talk were encouraging openness and discovery, openness to discover truth. And also maybe for the humanities in general, the value of language learning in the humanities, integrating the intellectual and the pragmatic. I think that's probably a key part to marketing ourselves in today's world. The next speaker will be Karen Evans-Romaine, who is professor of Russian in the Department of German, Nordic, and Slavic, and co-director of the Russian flagship program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's taught Russian at all levels, including an advanced course on Russian language media. She also teaches the graduate level course Methods of Teaching Slavic Languages. Dr. Evans-Romaine is co-editor with Lyudmila Klimanova of a special issue of Russian Language Journal devoted to teaching information literacy in Russian language education. I'll put the link in the chat again with the idea of this being a launching for developing new ideas. It's a fabulous issue.
Susan, thank you very much. It was an honor to be invited to be part of this panel on such an important topic, and I'm delighted to be taking part in our discussion of civil discourse, especially at this time where in many ways it seems to be lacking on the public square. So thank you very, very much. I will, with apologies to those who are familiar with my introduction to this course, I will show a few slides briefly introducing the course that Susan mentioned in her introduction, and then I will focus on moments in the course in which I show videos to students that model the various kinds of pragmatic strategies we need students to learn in order to engage in civil discourse by watching others engage in civil discourse in Russian. So let's see, I need to figure out first how to move. There we are. So this course is marked in red in the list here as part of our Russian flagship domestic curriculum. The course itself is not required. It is strongly encouraged as one of two options, one of which is taught in the fall. It's a capstone seminar that emphasizes reading and writing as well as speaking. And the course that I teach is taught in the spring and focuses on advanced listening and speaking. And while the fall course emphasizes usually literary texts and literary Russian, the spring course emphasizes media. So let's see, there we are. So the goals are quite predictable. Students tend to come into this course on the threshold of advanced high, intermediate high, and advanced low. Usually if they're pre-capstone students, since the course begins in late January, we hope are already at advanced low, because by that point they will have had to have taken their entrance exams, but some students take the course a year before. And so the idea is to put them solidly in the advanced range in speaking and listening. There is very little reading in this particular course, and writing is in the form of responding to homework questions rather than longer papers or essays. However, they do have to present. So we are very conscious that presentational speech, giving presentations, is a very important component of the Russian Overseas Flagship Program in Almaty. And so we are delighted to try to prepare students for much more intensive public speaking in that wonderful program that we're preparing them for. So the course, I should also add, we have no courses at UW-Madison which are open only to Russian flagship students. So the typical makeup of any course group, which is usually under 10, is a mix of Russian flagship students, advanced students who come to that course are at that level for a variety of reasons. So for example, last time I taught the course a year ago, a good third of the students were Heritage speakers who were not in the Russian flagship program, but had very, very strong speaking skills and were more interested in developing their media literacy, and graduate students. So we almost always have graduate students from various programs, primarily the Slavic doctoral program or our master's program from the Center for Russia, East Europe, and Central Asia in that course. So the thematic idea of the course is to expose students to selected issues and figures in Russian history, but not only in history of Russian-speaking countries. To a lesser extent, Russia still remains a focus, but not the only focus by any means. Contemporary press and politics, foreign policy, economics and economic policy, healthcare systems, and issues of national identity. And the idea communicatively is to enable students to understand and analyze various genres, particularly documentary film, news reports in radio and television, especially interviews, to some extent debates, and other genres. I would say the primary focus of the course is on interviews, because I want to see students observe discourse in that dialogic setting in the high, usually at a quite high register. So the idea also is to provide resources for further study of these topics for students interested in gaining their knowledge of Russian language media. So there's a constant focus on subject matter and language proficiency. In tandem, the focus in terms of proficiency levels is to keep the course at the advanced level solidly and to push students who are ready toward the higher levels of the advanced spectrum by providing some tasks that gear them toward the superior level. So I've given you the names of the genres already. And I tend to spiral using one figure in various different genres. There is a textbook from which I draw a great deal of discourse, and that is Larissa Moskvitina's Media Novosti, her 3-volume work. I draw from the first 2 volumes on politics and media, SME, and on business and economics. So we move back and forth from content to micro-level focus on language content, focusing on discourse features, for example, as Susan was discussing, to open discussion of the larger questions being discussed here, such as the questions that Tony mentioned in his presentation. The idea, as Susan has mentioned here and in other presentations, is to help get students to build islands that they can build on in order to work toward advanced and even superior level discourse, having chunks of speech. First, by noticing them, then by adapting them for their own use, and then incorporating them in their own speech. So typical course units the course tends to begin with history from the late pre-perestroika period. So I tend to begin the course in the mid-80s. I've moved that back for reasons I'll discuss in a moment. An introduction to some basic terminology on media in Russian that I take from Moskvitina's wonderful textbook, Press and Politics. Then I begin to integrate press and politics together, that is media and politics together. Then Russian domestic policy, then foreign policy, and economics, which I tie into foreign policy as well. Some years I emphasize healthcare more, for example, during the COVID years, some years less. So this last year, unfortunately, healthcare had to take a little bit of a back position because in the last 2 iterations of the course in 2023 and 2024, I put a much stronger emphasis on issues of censorship, self-censorship, regulation of speech from outside and from inside because of the vast changes in Russian language media since February, March of 2022, and the vast changes in the lives of major Russian media figures because of these political events. Also, there's greater and greater emphasis on culture and national identity because most of the students who study abroad from that course will go to Kazakhstan to study abroad. Where there's more and more discussion of the integration of language and national identity in various places where Russian is spoken, is the dominant or among the dominant languages coexisting with others. So among the resources I use is Rails, developed 20 years ago at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So I still use the Russia-focused materials from Rails, but now over the past year and a half, there's been very strong development of several modules focused on Kazakhstan, authored by my colleague Shannon Quinn at Michigan State University, who was one of the original team members of the first Rails team, and our graduate student in SLA, Lydia Galt, who presented yesterday on AI, on voice, AI-generated voice, which is fascinating, based on films gathered and made by our graduate student in Slavic, Asel Almuratova, who graduated from Nazarbayev University in Kazakhstan. So the course figures that I focused on in the last 2 springs that I taught the course were from Rails back in the 80s. Again, I used to begin the course during Perestroika and begin it with a discussion of the opening of media in the more recent political and media environments in Russia and in the US. I have moved back to Smekhov's marvelous discussion of censorship and how to avoid censorship in the Teatr na Taganke during the Brezhnev era. So we discuss strategies for avoiding censorship through that discussion of that video. I also show Parfyonov's documentary on Gorbachev and Vitaly Mansky's much later, 10 years later, made documentary of Gorbachev and discussed changes in Russia and in Gorbachev's life personally over those years. And today I'll be discussing as modeling interviews with Mansky by two different interviewers, Timur Alevsky and Natalia Sindeeva. Very different styles of interview, different discussions, but on the same film, on Mansky's film, Gorbachev Rai. In politics and foreign affairs, I focused on Braille's lessons based on interviews conducted with Irina Hakamada, which have become, I think, timely in ways they weren't a few years ago in her discussions of the 1990s, of the effects of economic shock therapy, and on the elections going up through 2004. Focus on transitions of power, that's one of the foci of the course, from Gorbachev to Yeltsin, from Yeltsin to Putin. What were the forces that led to these changes? And of course, more recently, since 2022, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Putin's announcement of the war, Zelensky's response, and then media coverage of these tragic events. I also use as examples of diplomatic speech, presentations and television, press conference, official presentations by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, because I want students to hear examples of official diplomatic speech, diplomatic announcements, diplomatic expressions of thanks, diplomatic expressions of objections, and so forth. I think that is important linguistic modeling for students to hear. So among the course figures that go through various genres I have featured are Boris Nemtsov, who has featured in documentary films, in interviews and so forth. Hakamada, I've mentioned. I show students Evgeny Albats's first interview with Mikhail Khodorkovsky, 17 часов на свободе, the first interview conducted immediately after he was released in 2013, interviews with Navalny, interviews that I won't focus on today with members of Pussy Riot. And on economics, my favorite subject to show students is the wonderful Natalia Zubarevich, again, because of the clarity of her explanations of economic phenomena and because of the quality of her discourse. It's marvelous speech modeling. Here are some other examples in documentary film. Marina Goldovskaya's discussions of avoiding censorship. Parfyonov and Mansky, their documentary filmmaking. Vladimir Karamurza, his documentary film on Nemtsov, and then a more recent interviews with him, which also serve as excellent speech modeling. Posner, who also always for Americans a really interesting speech model for various reasons that I'm happy to go into during the Q&A. With Yuri Dutz, whom I'll focus on less in today's theme, but he is certainly there. And in 2024, we had two guest speakers, Yelena Kostuchenko and Anna Nemtsov. And so we focused on their speech and their films as well. So here are the films that I've showed, had students watch, and that we've watched portions of in class. So now moving to discourse strategies. Some of the discourse strategies I want students to notice in these films, particularly in these interviews, and in some cases in diplomatic speech, are how to introduce a person. Of course, interviews are an ideal way to see how someone is politely introduced. A recent interview with Parfyonov sort of made fun of this genre of we have to pretend now that we don't know each other, which sort of points students to the fact that these interviews, there is an artificiality in those interviews where the interviewer and interviewee do know each other. But when they don't, this is an excellent example of a polite introduction of two speakers in high registers. How to introduce a topic, of course, that's something that tends to be more familiar from students since they've been giving presentations for several years at this point, but it's very useful to see this high register modeling of introducing a topic, changing course. These interviews provide examples of how to object to someone's point of view politely, how to interrupt politely, how to stop an interruption. I think for American students generally, certainly for students in Wisconsin, interruption and overlap in speech is a feature of discourse in Russian that they need to get used to. And it's something that they begin to get used to in interacting with Russian speakers in their interactions with tutors. But of course, all of us are trained to let them finish speaking, not to interrupt them and so forth. But I think it's very important for them to be exposed to the simple fact that one person's expression might cut in to the previous person's expression. Forgive me for not having looked up and used the appropriate linguistic term for this. Is that space, that interval is quite different from the interval in British and American English. And that is something that English speakers in the United States have a great deal of difficulty getting used to, just like differences in personal space. So in these interviews, I try to stop the videos and show them where one person's speech enters another person's speech before they're finished speaking, and that's a part of polite discourse and an expression of interest, and ways in which people continue speaking after that goes on, and continue in this sort of mode of mutual interruption of each other to express interest in the topic, but also ways in which people deflect interruption, politely stop someone so that they continue saying what they were saying without the emotionality that may take place in English language discourse, because it has different sociopragmatic functions in the two languages. So that to me is a really important kind of modeling I need to show students. Also, compliments show tremendous cultural differences. I use Mansky as an interesting subject because he speaks very differently to two interviewers, Timur Alevsky and Natalia Sindeeva. In the interview on Dozht that Natalia Sindeeva conducts with him as part of a film festival in the end of 2021 in Moscow, for the opening of his Gorbachev Rai, he begins with a compliment on her appearance that would, in an American context, be seen as highly unprofessional. It's meant as a compliment, and they know each other. They speak not thee, which is unusual in these interviews, but does happen occasionally. And to watch her both accept and deflect this compliment, I think is a culturally useful lesson as well. And different ways in which Russian speakers deflect compliments and give compliments, I think, is very, very important. Connected to this also is something I forgot to put in this list, but one of the reasons I use, there are many ways in these different videos in which people express thanks. One of the reasons I use Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister's speech, is that his diplomatic expressions of thanks to his hosts, thanks to the people present, thanks for any other particular reason, I think are very useful for students to hear as expressions of thanks in very, very high registers in very formulaic speech. So those are some examples that I use from these various different videos, in which case I never show entire films in class among that list I gave. The students are assigned to watch the whole thing or portions of it with many, many questions at home. In class, I take portions of these videos to stop, ask students to focus on a particular thing. What compliment does he give her? How does she respond to that compliment? How would you respond to that compliment if it were put in your direction? Or in what ways do these two interlocutors interrupt each other? And why is that interruption acceptable? And what does that express? And in what ways does someone stop an interruption? So I have dozens of examples of these, and I think for technical reasons, I won't stop and show these particular examples today, but I do have a list of, dozens is an exaggeration, about a dozen examples in these different categories. And if there's time later in the Q&A and particular interest in any specific examples, I'll be very, very happy to share them. Finally, students are required to give presentations at the end of this course on a subject absolutely of their choice, but it needs to be related somehow to the general topics of the course. And they are taught the kinds of strategies that Susan mentioned in her presentation in asking questions, in expressing agreement, expressing interest, requesting more information, or expressing, as I think I just mentioned, agreement or disagreement. So I will stop there. My sources are here, and I will thank you all very much and look forward to the next presentation. We'll be happy to take questions during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. If you're wondering how to spend your time this summer, I would love to see an article written on that one slide that you had with all of the examples. I think that would be so valuable for all of us. So our next speaker, Tatiana Pshenina, is a senior lecturer at Al-Farabi, Kazakh National University. She's the chair of foreign philology and translation studies and a language instructor in the Russian flagship program since 2014. Her PhD research was devoted to language personality, and she uses a cognitive approach to teaching bilinguals and polyglots, both Kazakhstani and American students. She also worked in the Summer Russian Language Teachers Program in Almaty last summer, 2024. And I'd like to put a link with the idea of referencing further possibilities. I'll put a link in the chat about that in case anyone would like to see. And I will get your PowerPoint presentation from the beginning here.
Do they speak English? Or will you let me speak Russian?
Можно и по-русски, пожалуйста.
Спасибо, потому что я хочу поблагодарить вас, коллеги, и по-русски я благодарю гораздо красноречивее, чем по-английски. Потому что наша цель, наша общая цель, конечно, вот эти прекрасные ребята, наверняка вы видите знакомые лица. Спасибо, Сьюзан, спасибо, Карен. За этих замечательных ребят сегодня мы смогли немножко заглянуть, как вам удается довести их до такого блестящего уровня, когда они к нам приезжают. И это и плюс, и минус, потому что когда они приезжают, конечно, они уже все умеют, и они совершенно не хотят учиться. Ну, я немного преувеличиваю, но такие есть товарищи. И нам приходится их убеждать, что им еще много-много чего стоит освоить, в частности, формальную речь. И вот эта фотография тоже очень хорошо показывает, ну, какой формальный стиль для американцев, как это возможно. Бывает сложно. Поэтому, пожалуйста, следующий слайд. Я подготовила короткую информацию о языке, о программе. Вот, для тех, кто не знает, ну, я не буду глубоко вчитываться, просто коротко. В казну программа «Флагман» с 2014 года, и кое-что мы вместе с коллегами уже изобрели нового. И мы подхватываем их с уровня, о котором сказала Карен, Advanced, и должны вывести их на Superior, но бывает и выше. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Угу. О языковой среде очень подробно рассказала профессор Сулейменова. Если кто-то захочет, вы сможете потом вернуться и прочитать подробнее. Я просто выделила факторы, которые важны для нас в Казахстане. Вот как среда для флагманцев. Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Так, можно дальше. Угу. Условия обучения флагман тоже для тех, кто не знаком с программой, можно посмотреть детальнее. Самое главное, мы их погружаем в язык во всех аспектах, поэтому нагрузка получается грандиозная. Вот, следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Вот, мы можем ко всему этому вернуться подробнее во время обсуждения. И вот это, я считаю, важно. Конечно, вы все знаете Brain Compatible Learning, обучение гармоничное мозгу. И, по сути, наша флагманская программа в Алматы строится на тех же принципах. Мозг уникален, для освоения нужен собственный опыт, важная роль эмоций, лучше, конечно, положительные. И на развитие влияет взаимодействие. Эти принципы встроены в нашу программу, хотя мы обычно не говорим о них явно. А дальше, пожалуйста. Итак, с какими сложностями сталкиваются флагманцы? Обратите внимание, это их рисунок. Вот как они себя чувствуют в условиях нашей программы. Да, видите, как им хорошо. Единственное, что их поддерживает в жизни, кофе и вафли. Ну и, конечно, добрая рука старосты. Итак, важные сложности. Культурный шок. Несмотря на долгую в общем-то, подготовку, все еще для них вызывают проблемы мотивы поведения русскоязычных и непривычные явления, с которыми не сталкиваются в Казахстане. Кроме того, сложности вызывают гибкие требования к предмету обучения. Это связано с тем, что мы стараемся предусмотреть индивидуальную траекторию для каждого студента. И поэтому бывает немножко непривычно. Например, у нас нет лексического минимума, а студенты к этому привыкли. И не сразу не все готовы переключиться к тому, что словарик каждый составляет самостоятельно под себя. Это просто один пример. К этому тоже надо привыкать. Учебная нагрузка действительно высокая. Более 30 аудиторных часов в неделю и 3 часа домашних заданий каждый день. Да, это очень тяжело. И кроме того, переход коммуникативных компетенций от достаточных, которые у них уже есть, к оптимальным для ситуации общения. У многих возникает вопрос. Я же могу говорить. Зачем мне говорить вот этими ужасными вашими формальными словами, когда я могу сказать простыми? Что мы делаем? Следующий слайд, пожалуйста. Да, вот еще рисунок наших флагманцев. Во-первых, мы подключаем разные сферы общения, и именно в аудитории с разговорным стилем мы работаем меньше, потому что у нас есть замечательная поддержка, принимающая семья и лингвопартнеры, они тоже студенты. И кроме того, есть практика производственная, то есть студенты находятся в коллективе, и там осваивают уже речь разной формальности по своей специальности. Кроме того, постоянно мы делаем акцент на сопоставлении американского, казахстанского и российского взглядов. То есть мы четко раскладываем по культурам, это немножко облегчает понимание и помогает студентам не впасть в ситуацию хаоса, как это было на предыдущей картинке. Кроме того, наш языковой курс организован тематически. Одна неделя, одна тема. Это очень четко выдерживается. Принцип опережения чтения, потому что мы даем базу, и потом на этой базе строим устную речь. Формат перевернутый класс. Прекрасно у нас сработал. Мы по-прежнему используем дистанционное домашнее задание. Я, например, вот в Canvas перед уроком за день или утром того же дня проверяю задание, даю обратную связь, и уже в аудитории студенты говорят правильными конструкциями, а не своими ошибочными, где они где-то были неправы. И, наконец, каждая тема обязательно завершается дискуссией, и форматы дискуссий у нас разнообразны. Итак, посмотрим дальше. Как мы раскладываем всю эту грандиозную, в общем-то, информацию по задачам обучения? Уровень домашнего задания, ну, вы видите, это первые 3 задачи. То есть, в принципе, то, что они раньше делали в аудитории в Америке, теперь они должны делать сами. Но мы их поддерживаем, мы им даем обратную связь. Собственно, на занятии мы структурируем информацию, выделяем связи и применяем те знания и умения, которые у них были в тексте, в живых новых учебных ситуациях. Иногда добавляем дополнительные источники информации по той же теме, меняя оценки, потому что оценки мы тоже отрабатываем на занятии. И, наконец, главная наша задача – применение уже интериоризованного знания в спонтанной речи, то, что происходит в дискуссии. То есть в дискуссии мы заодно контролируем, что, собственно, студенты усвоили, а что осталось у них только на бумаге в домашнем задании. То есть для нас такая двойная польза дискуссии, как для преподавателей. Дальше, пожалуйста. Кроме того, мы обязательно используем разные источники информации, и нам очень помогают внеаудиторные источники, что тоже немного непривычно. Если мы идем на экскурсии, это связано с темой недели. Если у нас по теме недели есть какой-то подходящий эксперт, мы его приглашаем, и студенты сами с ним беседуют. Дальше покажу примеры. Если мы идем в театр, мы потом используем эту информацию, привязываем к теме недели. Студенты сами дают где-то презентации, концерты, то есть что-то творческое. И кроме того, они могут использовать проекты, которые они раньше готовили в своих университетах по специальности на английском языке. Это для них немножко непривычно, что можно еще раз использовать то, что они уже сделали, но мы им объясняем, что здесь у них цель другая — рассказать об этом на другом языке, поэтому это тоже полезно. Итак, дальше. Угу. Несколько примеров. Когда мы говорим о такой сложной теме, как религия, мы обязательно добавляем беседы, во-первых, с православным священником, и, во-вторых, с имамом или с муллой. И у нас нашелся такой замечательный сосед, университет Нур-Мубарак. Вот это левый верхний слайд, где одновременно есть исламский университет, египетско-казахстанский, и у них же есть мечеть. И посмотрите на кадр внизу, вот сзади стоят наши студенты-флагманцы, за партами сидят девочки, ученицы, мы зашли в женский класс, там есть женские и мужские классы. Университета Нур-Мубарак. Вот, и тот же преподаватель, обратите внимание, культурный момент, преподаватель без платка, хотя она тоже женщина, девочки в платках, вот наши студенты, девочки тоже в платках, так как уважение к чужой религии. То есть это очень интересно, потому что как раз информация становится живой в собственном опыте, в общении с другими людьми на положительных эмоциях, потому что студенты того же возраста. Конечно, общаться с ними легче, чем вот посмотрите, как на фото с таким серьезным пожилым мулой. Конечно, это тоже важно, но такое живое общение, несомненно, более важно, потому что оно дает им разные взгляды. Дальше, пожалуйста. Ну, очевидно, что когда мы говорим о теме культура, мы тоже используем разные внеаудиторные источники, и где-то студенты ходят в театр, вы, наверное, видите знакомые лица на фотографиях, да? Где-то они ходят в музей, а во втором семестре они уже и сами выступают как эксперты. Вот обратите внимание, слева наверху кадр, мы были в музее музыки, вот там две студентки, которые специализировались по искусству. И они выступили как эксперты, они давали комментарии другим студентам на русском языке о музыкальных инструментах и о культурных особенностях. То есть, конечно, им приходилось говорить более формально, хотя они говорили со своими товарищами по группе. Кроме того, бывает у нас такой хитрый ход. С одной стороны, свободная тема. Вот, например, у меня студенты хотели обсуждать Виктора Цоя. Этого не было у нас в плане. Отлично. Я им устроила экскурсию по местам, где снимали фильм «Игла» с Виктором Цоем в главной роли. Мы прошли с ними по всем местам, которые снимались в Алматы, обсудили. А потом они все это рассказывали своим товарищам. И, конечно, пришлось говорить немножко более формально. Далее, обучение в действии. Вот Тони Браун упомянул, что в дебатах используются, ну и мы часто используем аудио, визуальные материалы, но мы как-то забываем о кинестетических модальностях. И вот в дебатах Тони Браун предлагал студентов выстраивать по степени их согласия, кинестетическая модальность. И там студенты у нас и танцевали, вы видели, и сами устраивали постановки, то есть участвовали в концертах. Я хочу показать, как устроена наша тема. Вот это буквально на этой неделе мы провели финальная тема «Диалог культур». Посмотрите на список. Устная речь идет после чтения, поэтому я здесь указала, какой текст сопровождает эти задания. Мы идем от научного текста через официальный публицистический к художественному, и потом дискуссия уже я. С одной стороны, я считается низким уровнем OPI, но с другой стороны, я на границе культур. То есть там происходит важный переход я в абстрактной теме. И вот здесь, я считаю, нам удалось в этом году вывести студентов. Полилог был в свободной форме, но они сами шли от своего опыта к абстрактным рассуждениям и получились очень интересные выводы. Хорошо. Дальше, пожалуйста. Какие форматы дискуссий мы используем? Да, вот тоже рисунок студентов. Знать 100 языков, что 100 умов. Конечно, чаще всего круглый стол с модератором, потому что это самая удобная форма. Кроме того, мы даем задание групповой презентации. Малые группы друг другу представляют общий маленький проект. Бывают индивидуальные презентации. Студенты больше любят индивидуальные, но мы их используем только иногда, чтобы они, что называется, отдохнули друг от друга. И иногда мы используем дебаты, но дебаты, знаете, в такой шуточной форме. Например, заседание Межгалактического альянса, то есть такая смесь дебатов с ролевой игрой. Время от времени происходит симпозиум с местными студентами. Местные студенты выступают своего рода экспертами по культурным особенностям Казахстана. Иногда у нас подключаются ролевые игры, например, спортивная разминка, как я говорила, кинестетическую модальность подключаем, потому что действовать и при этом говорить на чужом языке – это сложно, и нужно еще знать соответствующую лексику и следить за правильными видовыми формами. В общем, это тоже очень полезно. И кроме того, мы нашли такую интересную форму, как творческие презентации. Например, по теме праздники малые группы обязательно вместе представляют какой-то один праздник, но не рассказывают, как они привыкли, а показывают. То есть кто что делает, подключают аудиторию. И по теме виды искусства презентации уже индивидуальные и связанные с личными интересами, с личным опытом студентов. То есть кому что нравится, какой вид искусства нравится, кто умеет играть на музыкальном инструменте, кто у нас рисует, получается настоящий конкурс талантов. Дальше, пожалуйста. И, можно сказать, вишенка на торте, к чему мы все идем. Финальная научная презентация сочетает и подготовленную речь очень высокого формального регистра, и при этом в ответах на вопросы спонтанную речь, тоже в формальном регистре, в собственной специальности. То есть, можно сказать, это высшая точка наших студентов. И хочу выразить благодарность моей коллеге Сандугаш Кадыралиевне, которая доводит студентов каждый год до высочайшего уровня выступлений. Ну и, конечно, наши индивидуальные преподаватели. Вот. Если вам интересно, ссылки есть на следующем слайде. И буду рада побеседовать об этом подробнее во время дискуссии. Большое спасибо.
Спасибо огромное не только за ваш сегодняшний вклад в наш круглый стол, но еще за ваш вклад в вашу с коллегами исказную грандиозную работу с будущими специалистами. Очень благодарны. Следующий доклад тоже работает в флотной программе. Это Sandugash, Кадырьевна Санsyzbaeva, которая доцент кафедры русской филологии, мировой литературы Казахского национального университета имени Al-Farabi. Преподаватель семантики, функциональной стилистики современного русского языка, профессионально ориентированного русского языка и научно-исследовательского проектирования в лингвистике. Sandugash также преподает письмо и научную презентацию в программе «Флагман» Американских советов по международному образованию, и она автор научных трудов по вопросам преподавания русского языка как второго и иностранного, межкультурной коммуникации, национальной культуры, специфики языка. Вы, кажется, сами будете показывать слайды.
Я сама буду показывать слайды. Добрый день, уважаемые коллеги. Пользуясь случаем, хотела бы всех поздравить с таким замечательным праздником, 50-летним юбилеем Американской ассоциации преподавателей русского языка, и поблагодарить вас за тот большой невидимый фронт, который вы осуществляете для того, чтобы подготовить для нашей программы студентов. Низкий поклон и большое спасибо вам за это. Так, одну минуточку. Мы с Татьяной Евгеньевной не договаривались, но так получилось, что у нас очень похож один слайд. У Татьяны Евгеньевны он был финальный, а у меня он титульный. С одну минуточку. Сегодня я уже выступала в секции 4.1 по поводу научной презентации, поэтому на круглый стол я хотела бы рассказать о том, как мы пытаемся развивать репродуктивные и продуктивные навыки письменные у наших студентов-флагмана и поговорить с вами сегодня об этом. Прошу прощения. Ну, во-первых, начнем с того, что вы, наверное, все прекрасно знаете, что наши студенты отлично говорят. Но могут ли они также уверенно и грамотно защитить свою точку зрения или составить официальный запрос письменно? Часто именно этот разрыв мешает им по-настоящему освоить язык. И, как признались мне некоторые мои студенты, благодаря теме «Официальная переписка в мессенджерах» они смогли составить письма в медицинский центр сообщения, они смогли написать руководителю практики, чем были очень довольны. Поэтому это очень важная составляющая, о которой я сегодня хочу поговорить, или важный навык на продвинутом уровне изучения русского языка как иностранного, к сожалению, часто отходит на второй план. И считается, что именно он является ключом к подлинному мастерству, и поэтому сегодня хочу поговорить с вами об этом. Наши студенты уже могут довольно свободно общаться на русском языке, понимать сложные тексты, выражать свое мнение, но именно здесь возникает новая задача. Прошу прощения, собака решила активизироваться. Можно я закрою окно? Спасибо за ожидание, уважаемые коллеги. Хотела бы сказать, что именно на этом этапе происходят очень важные моменты, связанные с пониманием сложных текстов, с переходом от простого использования языка к более глубокому осмыслению и применению в различных сферах, например, академической, профессиональной сфере, социальной сфере. И в этом контексте можно сказать, что письменные навыки как раз являются таким важным связующим мостом между переходом от... Это не просто фиксация языка, да, а это важный переход от одной сферы общения в другую речевую ситуацию. Угу. На продвинутом этапе мы разбираем два вида писем. Первый вид письма, репродуктивное письмо, считается необходимым инструментом для того, чтобы воспроизводить какие-то готовые образцы. Обратила внимание на то, что в американской традиции университетов не так часто студенты составляют реферат. И в этом году при структурировании, составлении учебных материалов по письму, вы, наверное, слышали, что готовится в формате учебника, мы обратили внимание на то, что студенты с большой сложностью осваивают некоторые виды рефератов, например, репродуктивных и продуктивных. А реферат – это очень хорошее подспорье для подготовки к тем самым научным презентациям, о которых мы сегодня говорили. Также хочется обратить внимание на продуктивное письмо, поскольку на практике все виды писем составляются самим автором, да? Поэтому автор создает оригинальный текст, выражает свое мнение, анализирует, сравнивает, убеждает. И такие форматы, как эссе, рассуждения, письма с оценкой событий или явлений, творческие работы, которые направлены на выполнение заданий такого плана, написать, например, письмо, в котором сравнивается американская и казахская культура. Хотя студенты сказали о том, что они крайне редко пишут дружеские письма, и здесь даже было объяснение со стороны гендерной позиции, что девочки пишут больше и чаще, и длиннее письма и сообщения, чем молодые люди. Но, тем не менее, мы обратили внимание на то, что именно такого рода письма, в которых выражается мнение по какому-то проблематичному дискуссионному вопросу, это хорошее подспорье для написания в последующем формата эссе. Поэтому репродукция и продукция очень тесно связаны между собой, потому что нельзя написать хорошее оригинальное эссе, не понимая его структуры и не владея, например, языковыми клише. И освоение этих моделей помогает студенту иметь какую-то степень уверенности при создании свободного творческого письма. По-моему, я здесь пропустила, хотела обратить внимание на вот последний пункт. Написание эссе мы уже обсудили, собственное эссе, учебное эссе, эссе на основе исходных текстов. И в этих новых учебных материалах, которые мы предложили в этом году студентам для апробации и сказали им, что они являются нашими соавторами учебника, поэтому было очень важно иметь от них обратную связь. И я ребятам предлагала систему вопросов, на которые они отвечали, и говорили о том, какой материал был интересен, какие задания были сложными, какие задания были легкими, какие, на их взгляд, были полезными. И вот очень большой резонанс вызвало выражение недовольства, ответ на упрек, которые приняты в дружеских письмах на русском языке, потому что, как здесь мы столкнулись с проблемами и межкультурной коммуникации в том числе, потому что в американской традиции, как оказалось, несколько ребят сказали о том, что была такая речевая ситуация, когда один студент не дождался другого студента и написал ему письмо с выражением недовольства. А они должны были завершить групповой проект до завтрашнего дня. И студент, который прочитал этот текст, сказал о том, что я бы не стал такое письмо писать даже с пассивной агрессией. Я бы просто пожаловался профессору на то, что второй студент не выполнил свою часть занятия и задания, и поэтому он подвел нас вместе с нашим групповым проектом. Что является, конечно, абсолютно противоречивой конструкцией для молодых людей казахстанских, потому что сказать что-то за спиной студента, тем более не поговорив с ним тет-а-тет или не попытаться связаться с ним, это немножечко не совсем принято, да? Поэтому посредством такого творческого письма мы еще и наткнулись на особенности межкультурной коммуникации. Обратить надо внимание на то, что в учебнике мы попытались систематизировать учебно-научную, официально-деловую, культурную, социальную сферу общения. И очень большой упор в первой части учебника, в первом семестре был сделан именно на официально-деловой стиль и научный стиль, поскольку в первом семестре в декабре идет первый формат научной презентации, первые защиты научных проектов, когда студенты активно пользуются клишированными конструкциями, навыками понимания, освоения первичных текстов и составления вторичных текстов, которые являются хорошим подспорьем для курса языка научной презентации. Конечно, роль преподавателя в процессе усвоения письменных текстов очень большая. Мы не только должны давать им задания, но и обучать стратегиям письма, мы обеспечиваем их различными моделями, стараемся обеспечивать им качественную обратную связь в виде комментариев, объяснений, предлагаем использовать другие конструкции вместо тех, которые нам кажутся неподходящими к допустим, к данному формату письма или речевой ситуации. И фокусируемся не только на грамматических ошибках, но также постараемся помогать ребятам выстраивать логику, структуру и стиль текста. И в этой связи здесь у нас находится в зале Куралай Баймаханова, мой ассистент по письму. Она мне оказывает очень большую помощь в этом деле, за что я ее благодарю. И завершая свое выступление, хотелось бы подчеркнуть, что целенаправленно развивая навыки репродуктивного и продуктивного письма на уровне B2, мы не просто учим студентов писать по-русски, мы инвестируем в их будущее. Как бы громко и пафосно эта фраза не звучала, помогая им стать не просто пользователями языка, а компетентными, думающими, успешными личностями, которые способны формулировать свои мысли, сложные коммуникативные задачи в русскоязычной среде и передавать это посредством письма. Это огромный навык, с которым многие студенты, к счастью, от нас уходят. Письмо – это действительно ключ к мастерству. Поэтому развитие навыков на уровне B2 – это не просто академическое требование, а это способ глубокого осмысления информации, четкого выражения собственной позиции. И в конечном итоге это, конечно, ключ к успешной академической и профессиональной самореализации студента в русскоязычной среде. Завершить хотела бы я этим текстом, который был составлен на занятии по письму. вашей студенткой Сьюзен, если вы увидели внизу, Женева Флорес. Тема была в рамках, вернее, текст был написан в рамках темы описания, и там буквально за 15 или 20 минут Женева вот создала вот такой текст, который я хотела бы вам сейчас прочитать. На краю ночи весь мир ждет в тишине и покое, не показывая внутреннего ожидания. Птицы еще не начали щебетать, животные спят, и небо нависает над светом, как бесконечный чернильный занавес. Сначала ты не замечаешь неуловимого изменения в тишине, но потом слышишь, как деревья в полусне бормочут что-то между собой. Первая наглая птичка выпускает тихое начало своей утренней песни. Через мгновение, без предупреждения, оживает весь мир, и загадочные звуки наполняют воздух. И все это сопровождает прорыв первого луча на горизонте. Спасибо большое за ваше внимание. И если вы заметили, на этом рисунке я дала задание искусственному интеллекту дать изображение молодого человека с вдумчивым взглядом, который осмысливает какую-то идею и пытается ее перенести на бумагу. Вот такая получилась в итоге приятная картинка. Благодарю всех за внимание. Если есть вопросы, с удовольствием отвечу.
Спасибо огромное. Я надеюсь, что наши студенты не слишком наглые птицы, когда к вам приезжают.
Наши студенты прекрасные.
И финальный, но никогда не последний, Dan E. Davidson is Emeritus Professor of Russian and SLA at Bryn Mawr and the founding president of the American Councils for International Education and current director of the American Councils Research Center in Washington. He's author, co-author, or editor of 24 textbooks and academic collections and 50 scholarly articles in the fields of language, culture, and second language acquisition, including a landmark 20-year longitudinal investigation of adult second language acquisition in the overseas immersion context. I'll put a link in the chat to his most recent study, What Makes Study Abroad Transformative, comparing linguistic and cultural contexts and learning outcomes, Arabic, Chinese, and Russian, in virtual versus in-person contexts, as well as a link to his co-edited book on transformative language teaching and learning.
Thank you very much, Susan. Thank you for organizing this panel and for all of you who are participating in it. I was thrilled that our colleagues from Krasnu were able to present and to share some glances at the new flagship overseas capstone textbook. You saw a sample today of one of 24 new units. The old flagship overseas program had operated with a textbook of Dobry Put that was created in 2004, 2005 in St. Petersburg. And we now are working, thanks to the work of the faculty who are co-authors, using an entirely new curriculum that is focused on the Russophone world more broadly. Anyway, it was great to see those samples today, and also congratulations to you, Susan, on your student and her poetic skills there. We could go on. Anyway, my sense is, Susan, correct me if I'm wrong, we have about 5 minutes. So rather than run, am I right? Or
I think we can always find more time for you.
Okay, well, I don't know. I don't mean to run over it all, but if we can, I can move, I think, very quickly because there's such a rich amount of information on the table here already. I just have a few kind of summary comments to make, which I think are kind of consistent with what you have already heard. As you're bringing that up, let me just stress that as you look at there it is, next slide. Thank you. Just a reminder, there are many sets of standards focused on what we mean by level 3 intercultural and linguistic competence. People on this call know what they are, but I was going to share this particular one because it is the last set of standards intercultural standards set by our own Department of Education in the final months of the Obama administration. Just to remind you what it is we're targeting here. When we go to level 3 and above, we're talking not just about student learning, but we're talking about professional roles. These are folks who will go into professional roles in the government, in academia, in business, in the developmental world, with levels of language that go well beyond demands on their language, that go well beyond the kind of normal, a competent user of language. Proficiency in 2 languages, advanced socio-emotional and leadership skills. This is what it says: ability to effectively collaborate and communicate with people in cross-cultural settings, demonstrated ability to engage in wide range of civil and global issues, sensitive to differences, open to diverse perspectives, appreciative of insight gained through open cultural exchange. This is picked up as well in our world readiness standards. We are looking at people who can get things done in another society, who can represent our government or represent business, who understand how to build and maintain relationships in that context. So we're talking here about people who are not only themselves able to function well and professionally, but are able to serve as well as mediators for others, not being the eternal American who has to be mediated by local people, but rather able to take on that role. Next slide. This is a tall order. And there are interesting linguistic and cultural reasons why it's tall. We see 2 challenges, and you've heard a little bit today from Sandugash and from Tatiana about the nature, how acute those challenges can be. I like the formulation of a former graduate student, Valerie Pellegrina, about the singular importance of our students acquiring a level of identity competence in an intercultural setting. These are people that have first to be able to master their own reactions to their long-term immersion and to their functioning in a bicultural setting. They have to learn to recognize and adjust their responses, linguistic, cognitive, and socio-emotional. You heard that from other presenters today. It isn't just the cognitive dissonance that is at stake. It's sometimes very acute social and emotional reactions to things that either cause dissonance or judgments to be leveled. As social actors in the intercultural arena, our learners are constantly engaged in an open performance of a rather personal act, construction of the self. The actor looks to the listeners as a measure of his or her performance. They're constantly evaluating their speech and their cultural behaviors in light of the reactions those provoke among the people, and then dealing and incorporating that feedback into their next act. We have a great mechanism in the flagship program, which is the online language journal, which is a monitored and two-way journal with an advisor. And we understand how important it is for the students to monitor and evaluate each and every speech act that they engage in. And we'll see they do that and they become quite accomplished. Register is all important in Russian, as you know, and as you reach level 3, there are multiple registers that you must master in order to be level 3. Let's go to the next challenge. So let's think of it as cultural identity. And the second one is responding to divergent cultural orientations of the world. Flagship students learn to manage interactions between people of different and divergent affective, cognitive, and behavioral orientations to the world. And they learn to do that in an appropriate and effective way over time. It takes at least a year. Quite apart from their dealing with their own uncertainties and anxieties, they're also dealing then with the actual dialogical situations that develop for them. And as one of the students said to me, I took these scenarios and I took the cultural roundtable. I understand that's all important, but frankly, compared to grammar and the area, I saw it as sort of a one-off deal. And I saw it as a one-off deal until I got to Kazakhstan, where I realized it was 24/7. It was never not a part of my life. And they sort of saw the importance of what we're now talking about. Managing, and then I list all the different situations, from public speaking to host family relations to interacting with their managers in their internships to those group discussions that you heard our faculty talking about a short time ago. Next slide. So getting to the business of civil discourse, I'm only going to focus on the topic that Susan asked us to talk about today. Obviously, there are many more out there we could take, but disagreement, let's take just the issue of disagreement, because that involves every time an American student opens her mouth, there has to be a certain socio-pragmatic strategy selection. I need to disagree here. And the issues of disagreement are well expressed. I like Tony's history of debates and how you can get this opinion spectrum. And we know that opinion spectrum is informed, whether it's a topic or whether it's a function, it's informed by the value system and the belief structures that are inside that person. And here is where the big differences exist. Do our premises align? What are we looking at? What do we make of it? Do you and I even agree that we're looking at the same thing, using the word we just took? If we agree, at least we're talking about the same thing, or we think we are. What do we make of it? How do you even align premises at sort of that very basic level? Now, Western academic styles are not our friend in this, particularly US, particularly humanities and social science styles. If you've gone to an MLA conference ever, you'll know what I'm talking about. The style is very confrontational, and it tends to be aggressive. It tends to challenge not a detail, as Tony was suggesting you should be doing. Rather, it'll challenge the premise itself. It'll challenge the assumption. It'll say that the explanatory framework you're using is wrong and always has been wrong. We can be quite aggressive in our public debates, especially again in the humanities and social sciences conferences. You see that at faculty meetings sometimes as well. So Western argumentative style is just that. It is not the right model for operating in most other parts of the world. We are trying to judge arguments by their content rather than their ethos or their affect. In recent years, there's been a lot of judgment, arguments based not on content, but on ethos and affect. Next slide. To summarize, they say this, but I say this. That's pretty American, and it's evident even in our debate style. If our goal is to persuade you and be correct, as opposed to the British style, which is to somehow clarify the point and get closer to rapport, that in some ways says a lot. Rather than they say, I say, rather than a binary reduction, if we can see argumentation and disagreement as focused on amplifying a point, extending a point, building on another idea, rather than contradicting and correcting the people in whom you're arguing with. That's a useful structure that will work in this part of the world. One also needs to have a better command of the language of disagreement. And I just want to pass, by the way, an excellent set of studies that appeared a few years ago in PMLA called Cultures of Disagreement with Pardis Dabashi and Heather Love of Brown University. If you have PMLA around, you might want to take a look at it, find that interesting. It's more the focus on our issues here in the US. Next slide. Disagreement, language depersonalization. You need to have the strategy, but you also need to have the language. And here, if Susan can train our domestic students and her colleagues to know how to disagree, then when we get to this level of register, you have to know how to take that phrase and depersonalize it. Я не согласен may be correct Russian, but it's not the right Russian in a sensitive disagreement situation. What do Russians really say in that case, right? С этим приходится согласиться, с этим нельзя согласиться. Эту идею нельзя поддержать. Трудно согласиться. Notice the impersonalization, the use of impersonal sentences in place of "я". One of the single biggest problems we have with our students, if you look at their interlanguage at this level, is a dreadful overuse of the pronoun "я". All kinds of "я" constructions where Russians would never say "я". And that has to do, let's go with the last slide.
Sorry,
Yeah, if we move one more, last one.
I'm trying to get that to go.
Oh, thank you. You probably all make use of this, but
Инструкции, как это сделать, да. Мы
Супер, спасибо большое, спасибо.
уточним детали и сделаем, да. Мгм. Так, опять кто-то записывает. Так, товарищи. Dan,
Отключаю.
did you have time to finish your? Sorry, we had to do it. We had to close the rooms to
that's
give
okay.
space.
We were almost there in the final seconds, so it's not a problem. Not a problem. Thank you.
Sorry, we had to make difficult
Женя,
decisions.
отключи пока тогда запись.